Welcome to the Fulton Films Red Carpet Film and TV series, A Hybrid Experience. I'm Tracy Flanagan. Thank you for joining us. We're talking about crime series Fascination and film facts. We're privileged to have the best in the world of producing crime series and telling these important stories. Please welcome retired Atlanta Police Detective David Quinn, producer of ATL Homicide, in its fourth mind-blowing season. He solved the coldest of the cold cases.
And we were like, that's it.
Angeline Hartman, award-winning journalist, host of the podcast Inside Crime with Angeline Hartman, is a compassionate crusader for crime victims. Our third panelist brings a unique perspective as the man who puts the case together and takes it to the jury. With a record of winning 98% of his cases over 25 years as a prosecutor, Clint Rucker has tried some of the highest profile cases in Fulton County. Welcome, panelists. One of the things that just amazes me is Atlanta seems to be one of the best places for these shows. There's just a fascination with Atlanta and the Fulton County cases. What do you think about that? Why is that?
I just think Atlanta, while it's a huge metropolitan city, it's still got a small town feel. I mean, it's the only city you can go into, go to dinner, and run into 4 or 5 people that you know. I mean, that doesn't happen in Philly or New York. I mean, this place, while it's big, it's small, and people, they know the stories by watching the news, and it just made sense when true crime just took off that they, see the behind the scenes of what happened in these stories they see depicted on the news. Atlanta is just that place. And I think that, true crime found its true home here.
I think Fulton County is a really interesting place for crime shows because it offers a variety of things, a variety of people, a variety of stories. I mean, stories that go back from a long time ago to stories that are happening now. And, Fulton County, Atlanta is evolving every year. And it's just unique when we're talking about the United States. So it's interesting to everybody.
The cases are complex. They deal with the things that people who like to watch television find very interesting. There's always a mix of money and sometimes sex, sometimes race, sometimes politics. And sometimes the cases involve very interesting motives. And so I think that when you put all of that together, I think that makes for very interesting storytelling.
Tell us, what is the premise of The Real Murders of Atlanta?
Right. So the premise of the show is to cover murders that occur here in the Metro Atlanta area. And so the show seeks to cover these cases in a way that involves actual participants for that particular case. And so they will go out and they will find former prosecutors, find former investigators, find family members, and ask them to come on camera to tell their story or their perspective about what happened during that case. And I really appreciate being able to participate. The season that one that just ended, they covered several of the cases that I actually prosecuted. And so I was able to kind of come on and share my perspective and give a lot of the backstory, the behind the scenes, the information that's not generally known to the public about what surrounded the case.
So James Sullivan was able to make his wealth by inheriting a very, very profitable liquor distributorship. Sullivan sold that business for between $5 and $7 million.
Alita graduated from Spelman, took a job working in a boutique, and that's where she met James.
Fundamentally, it's because we're all connected as human beings in some form or fashion. And I think stories like this, they provide fodder for great stories. And so, you've got, a person that you might not know, but you get to learn about that person's life. And then there's something very tragic that happens to that person. And then, you get caught up in okay, well, who could have done something like this? And then you get to follow along the investigation and start to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And all of a sudden you start to see a picture. And then, folks like to see how it ends, where there's a hero somewhere in the story that comes along and is able to obtain justice for, that person's family and for their memory. And it kind of just comes full circle, and it gives people, the opportunity to participate in these stories, which are really, really compelling. They're really interesting, and they impact the community.
Atlanta is a sexy, beautiful city, but there's a dark side beneath the surface. We work hundreds of murders in the city of Atlanta.
Dead men don't tell a story, but they do. That's why we're here. We're telling their story for them.
We want to stake our claim in the City of Atlanta Homicide Unit.
Justice has to be served.
ATL Homicide is a love letter to the city of Atlanta. In other words, this show, when we were launched, it was all about the people, the families left behind, when someone gets killed in that nucleus, in that family. We always had this thing, and I'm talking about me and my partner, Vince Velasquez, called investigative transparency. There were no real secrets. And so I was really against using media to help me solve crimes. And ATL Homicide doesn't ever happen without Angeline Hartman. It was her idea. She got us going because years ago, when she was a local correspondent here in the city, a reporter on the streets, she used to try to get me to put my unsolved cases on TV. And
He wouldn't even say hello. Can I just stop? It's worse than that. He didn't even acknowledge me when I'd walk into the building. He would just turn away. He couldn't even think about being on a story, let alone talk to a reporter. So just put that in perspective. Go ahead, David, go ahead.
Okay.
That is absolutely true. I felt like I was a street soldier. I was a dyed-in-the-wool street cop. I was all about the people. I didn't fool with TV. My partner, Vince Velasquez, he tried to talk me into using it as a vehicle to move these cases, to make them pop, to give them some shine. And I wasn't having it.
I'm Angeline Hartman in Atlanta, Georgia, where we're shooting one of our big cases that's set to air in June. This is the former Big Buy supermarket where Officer Alfred Johnson was killed more than 30 years ago. Detective Vince Velasquez is the lead detective on this case now, and so after 30 years, just think that it can be solved.
Well, we've solved cases older than 30 years old, and we're hopeful that no matter how old this case is, it's near and dear to our hearts because this is one of our own.
Just a brief synopsis. What happened that night? He was basically here working an extra job.
He was. Two armed men come to the store, one wearing a mask, one without, one with a sawed-off shotgun and one with a pistol. The guy with the shotgun goes right up to Officer Johnson, tells him, you know what this is? Officer Johnson fought for that weapon, tried to take that weapon from that person, and he was shot.
Angeline used to come to my cubicle whenever she was in the building, an old headquarters. And I would shun the idea.
I don't even think he knew my name. I don't think
I knew your name.
No, he didn't. People think we were friends from Atlanta. I didn't know him in Atlanta. No. It comes later, but go ahead. But I was friends with his partner, Vince. I will say I was the first person to put Vince on television in Atlanta way back when he was starting out as a detective. And he was open to media. And so it just lined up that way. So it's a very funny contrast where by this time, Vince, had been on our television station many times and was starting to learn how to navigate the media. While this one, his partner over here, couldn't get away from it. Could not be farther.
So the Fulton County DA's office had a nickname for me and Vince because Vince was using media. He got the nickname Hollywood, and then they called me Hollyhood because I was always in them streets, and it stuck. Everybody knew it even before we got a show. And Angelina's the one. She's the catalyst for me even being in front of a television camera doing anything. And it just mushroomed into this love letter to the city of Atlanta called ATL Homicide. It's Atlanta's show.
And your take on that, Angeline?
Well, that's the short version of what really happened, but it's accurate. He is right. ATL homicide, I always thought there was a story to do in Atlanta where we could do it differently and tell it from their perspectives. You would see these other crime shows happening outside of Georgia, and there were other detectives and other, just different perspectives. And I thought it's not even close to what we could do with their personalities and their personalities together, and then the city of Atlanta and the stories they tell and their connection to the community and how they were unique as detectives. So there was all that wrapped up in my mind. But just to finish that story, so when I left Atlanta, I went to America's Most Wanted, and it wasn't, when I mentioned earlier that David didn't talk to me until I left Atlanta. Fast forward to when I go to America's Most Wanted, he has a case, and we eventually do that case. That took a while to do that. So this is when he first opens up. And back then, we could talk an hour about just that case. But that case, I remember thinking back then, there's something to do here in the future with him, whether it's a year from now or 10 years from now, 20 years from now, but there's a future show. And my friend, a producer also at America's Most Wanted, we had talked about that. And fast forward, I hear David's retiring, and I call him up and I say, hey, have this idea. What do you think? Like, now you're actually retiring. Can we actually make this television show? At the time, we didn't know it was going to be ATL Homicide. There were a lot of working titles, but that's how it was born, because we did move forward with it. And I mean, it's just amazing to see how an idea like that can actually become reality. And it's because, they hung with it, because here's two guys. I mean, they had experience in television, but it was totally, when you work behind the scenes in TV, you realize how much work it is and how many no's there are as you are, climbing to get that one yes. So it was quite a journey.
I was one of those people behind the yellow tape, trying to get just any kind of soundbite, any kind of little nugget about the story. And, we couldn't get anything from you. And I get that. But now you're letting people inside the tape through the program. So when you talk about that.
So that we came up with this terminology, investigative transparency. In other words, when I first came to Homicide in the year 2000, I meet Vince. We decided that we were going to open arms and, shepherd these families through these tragedies. And the best way you do that is you give them your cell phone number. Now, this was the year 2000. Remember when, talking on the cell phone cost money. And so cops would not give their cell phone number. They would give their desk phone number. So every day you arrive at your office at Homicide, it'd be a blinking light because the family didn't have access. But when you give the mama, the auntie, the grandmama, whoever raised this poor victim, they've got access to your cell phone. They don't call you all the time. You've established that trust. They have a way to get you when they need you. And it's part of the healing, in my estimation, because they feel like they're a part of it. I mean, sometimes people can help you in homicide investigations involving their loved ones with just the nuance. They don't even know they're helping you. And so we opened up those living rooms and we dropped anchor and we planted flags in those living rooms. And that's where the love came from the community. People were asking us after a couple of years, why do people tell you guys everything that's going on? Because, this was in the beginning. There weren't any phone records. There was no real DNA. It was in its infancy. It was all about shoe leather and trust. And the people in the street had to trust you if you're going to make any kind of inroads out there. Can I say one thing about Angeline? Just this, I have to say this. So when I take my training wheels off and I trust Angeline for the first time, she's not even in the city like she talked about. She's now national. She's at America's Most Wanted. The case that she decided to showcase became the case of my career. It was one murder that she depicted on America's Most Wanted. It turned into solving 7 other murders off that one case involving the same crew. Wow. And I'm writing a book about that because that changed my life. when I first dipped my toe in and allowed this sister Angeline to help me out, it changed the whole trajectory of my career. And it really got me comfortable with the camera because I was allowed to be me. As ghetto as I am, as street as I am, I just didn't think that would translate on TV. You know, I know ghetto is an old word, but that's just where I come from. And I was a man of the people. I didn't know that was going to cross over. But Angeline said, just be you. And that's exactly what TV One said. Now, mind you, we got turned down by a bunch of other doors, some of these bigger networks with true crime already part of their footprint. TV One allowed me and Vince to be ourselves. Two minorities, a Puerto Rican and a Black, had never been done before on the same show. It was beautiful.
Wow.
The beautiful thing. And I will just say, when he's talking about be yourself, getting back to that America's Most Wanted segment, you know, part of that, you know, in America's Most Wanted, we did reenactments and, you know, to showcase the crime and help connect our viewers with the case so that they could in turn hopefully figure out what was happening, and if they knew anything, call in for tips, right? And so when we were doing the reenactment and mapping it all out and figuring out how to portray the story, my partner at the time, Sedge Torreson, who is the executive producer of ATL Homicide, so he and I worked on this case together with David, and he said, why don't we have David Quinn play himself in the reenactment? And we went to our bosses and we're like, oh, we think he can pull this off. And it was like, we're going to have the actual cop play himself in the reenactment. Because you have to understand, it's when we did a reenactment, it was like a Hollywood movie set. We hire actors and we have trailers. I mean, it is no different than a Hollywood movie set. But to bring in the actual detective to play himself was like rare and weird. And but we, you know, saw something in him and said, he can do this. Just let him be himself and let him go. And that's what happened. And so this ATL Homicide is almost like just a natural follow through from that first America's Most Wanted story.
I was blown away by that. I couldn't believe it. And we didn't tell the other actors I was the real guy until maybe day 2 of the shoot. They thought I was like, who's this guy coming in from Atlanta to play the main guy? And they said, why does he never take the prop gun off? He walks around with it to the bathroom, to the eat at the commissary and everything. I said, this is a real gun. I'm the real guy.
Not a prop gun.
It was crazy. It was bananas.
Not a prop detective.
I wouldn't do the scripts. I said, well, I know the story. Just, you know, have the lead actor, you know, the other guy across from me talking to me most, let him just know, and then the rest of them can be in the dark. It was unbelievable. It was the most exciting 3 days of, at that time, my young life. It was amazing.
Wow.
It was a fun show, very fun show. And we did a lot of America's Most Wanted shoots in Fulton County in the city of Atlanta because, number one, because there was so much to showcase there. But once I left, you know, Channel 5 here and went to America's Most Wanted, I was assigned to I was assigned to Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, and South Carolina as a producer. In other words, I would watch this region to figure out what are the cases that need the help, where that we can profile these fugitives. And so with that direct tie, you know, I'm from Atlanta, I lived in Atlanta for all these years, and I had these obvious connections. It just elevated Atlanta even more. And so you were seeing Atlanta on America's Most Wanted like every week. So it was really nice.
Well, David, let me ask you this. Okay, you were close to the idea from the jump. When you eventually decided to do this, I have to wonder if you knew then what you know now about how it could help your cases, what would be your perspective? What would you tell yourself?
I would tell myself to step out there on faith. I mean, we had a popular TV reporter that everyone knew, award-winning producer, you know, just trust. You know, I wasted a lot of time and I had to resole a lot of shoes when I could have cut my work in half. I definitely could have cut my work in half if I'd have used that. Because once Angeline let the cat out of the bag, that was late 2005, 2006. I was off to the races. After we knocked down that first case, and I got to say the victim's name, his name was Mamadou Barry. That case launched 1,000 ships. I was on TV every month because, you get a homicide every month. So I would get with Doug Evans at Fox 5, and we would hook that thing up every week. Later on, I couldn't believe the traction I was getting in my cases by, being in living rooms. And people said they hear that voice while they're cooking their dinner and they would turn around. I said, what voice? I said, something about your voice. I said, what? I mean, it's just a voice, what's up? Nah, we hear your voice and we listen up because you may say something crazy. And I figured, well, just be yourself and it'll get the attention of the people, and they may tell about my crazy ass. They may talk about what I was doing, and it may get someone talking about a criminal homicide that's unsolved. And that's exactly what happened.
I remember that case. Another disclosure, I worked for the Sheriff's Office in Public Affairs, and that case touched our office as well, because when you got the person, where did they go? 901 Rice Street. So I do remember that one.
It was 15 of them, and they created courtroom 1C. It became, the Checkpoint Charlie or, Hartsfield Jackson at 160 Prior. I mean, it became that courtroom for all the high-profile, dangerous cases. I mean, we had 15 co-defendants on a 60-count indictment. It was the first successful gang prosecution under that statute. It was the first one. Angeline got that started. It was unbelievable what happened there just from, like I say, dipping my toe in. And it got rid of 15 bandits that were terrorizing our city and killed 8 people in Fulton County in the space of 2 years post-Katrina.
Wow.
When you talk about why are people fascinated with crime, just listen to his story. I mean, they are intrigued by stories that are almost so unbelievable that you just can't even imagine them. And that case is a good example. And then what happened after that? I mean, again, I know this is not supposed to be about that case, but it just, so many things that you could not even imagine happened with that case. So that is the answer to why are people so fascinated with crime, because it's almost, they're watching something that's almost unrealistic. But it's actually real. So.
Well, I mean, Angeline, the last thing we got to say about Mamadou Barry case was when you guys did the reenactment and had me playing myself, that cleared the murder. The actual shooter said, wait a minute, he's got it wrong. He tells an informant, Quinn's got it wrong in America's Most Wanted. I'm the one that killed the guy. And he tells the guy that ends up coming into our phone.
You got to explain that a little bit more, because I know what happened and I don't even know what you just said. So just explain that just a little bit.
I'm doing the scene where I'm shopping, for my kids' tennis shoes during Christmas. And we're shooting that scene down there in Maryland, the DMV somewhere. And that scene makes it to that 15-minute movie we did on America's Most Wanted. And so one of the killers tells the guy, well, they looking at the wrong people. I'm the actual killer. And that was of Mamadou
watching
Barry.
America's Most Wanted.
He was watching the show, and he tells the guy that eventually folded and came forward. And that's what started everything. It launched everything based on the killer watched the show. And then that's amazing right there.
That's unbelievable.
Well, that brings me to one of my questions, devil's advocate here. Some people might say these shows show too much. Maybe criminals learn too much seeing these shows. What do you think about that?
I don't believe it. I'm going to tell you what. So we've had body worn cameras for the last 5 to 7 years on cops. People are still cutting up. There's surveillance video everywhere. Everybody knows cops, the feds track you on your cell phone if you do some dirt. Folks are still doing dirt. It's not going to change. And I'm going to tell you this last thing, Tracy. The last thing is people are going to be people. They're going to do that people thing. Because what happens when you get down to the homicide office And you know, at some point you're going in that room. That's your own personal moment of truth. You can say how hard you're going to be, but nobody wants to do life plus 5. And so it changes. The calculus changes once these prospective suspects are put in play. I think it's just, you know, I tell it all. I'm like a preacher, just tell it. Give the gospel up. I tell the whole case. People used to get mad at me because I'll tell the whole thing because I want a prospective suspect to refute what I've put together.
And that worked out.
It worked out big time. And I always felt like, and Vince would concur, my partner Vince Velasquez would concur, cops since time immemorial have always held up this wall. Well, we can't compromise the investigation because it's ongoing. Ongoing means that joint is cold. It ain't going nowhere. So you got a situation where you're not being forthcoming with information, you're losing evidence. I believe let's just tell it. Let's just make it happen. And so that, you know, that's what has to happen. And we always told the story. Give it up, you know, and see if somebody can come up and say, oh, you're wrong and here's why. I don't remember it happening.
Well, I will say, Tracy, regarding your question about victims and telling too much, I hear what David is saying, but there also is the part as a producer. There is so much that is not told, that never makes it on air, that people don't know. And whether it's based on some things that we need to preserve for the investigation or sensitivity for the families, you know. So while people may say like it's too much, you know, if they have no idea what really is too much, because in every case, I can tell you with ATL homicide, there are things that don't make it, you know, while he tells everything, there is stuff that ends up on the cutting room, you know, floor. And that's one of the things that made America's Most Wanted so successful, is because we were working in partnership with our law enforcement. We would work together and figure out what it is that can be told to the public for the benefit of the case that would help the detectives, and then also be sensitive to the families and work with the families and put that together in a product that would be compelling television, figure out how to do all of that. There were so many stories behind the scenes and so much information that the public never knew about. But yeah, of course, we're always thinking about the victims and how this is going to impact them.
I've seen it be helpful. Actually, David, I saw your partner become a therapist on a crime scene. We were actually doing a search, canvassing a neighborhood to see if they could find someone who had killed this lady's daughter. And your partner took out time to console the lady. And so some of the stories, I think, also have a therapeutic effect for the families.
Absolutely. I'd have to agree with you. You know, whenever our cases air in an episode format on ATL homicide, I'll usually talk to the families a couple of days, maybe a week before it actually airs, because, you know, we want to be sensitive to their feelings. I don't want a small child to see it without, you know, some kind of parental guidance. And so we always maintain those relationships, and those people will call us if they have an issue with something. But we're always sensitive to how it makes them feel. Nobody wants to really see their daddy killed on national television. And so we want to soften the blow and give them access. And that's what we always try to do.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that happens behind the scenes that people don't realize. Like you just mentioned, Tracy, like sometimes they become therapists. Cops become therapists, producers become therapists. And it's just really about, you know, for me, it's about listening and treating somebody the way you would want to be treated, right? It's just that simple. You know, there's just a lot happening behind the scenes that never makes it on television. And those building the relationships and talking to families and spending time with the victims, that doesn't end up on TV a lot. But it does happen, and it's because they do care. And that is what makes the difference between these detectives and some others.
We've got issues with people trusting the police. people see you on television every week and they're able to stream it and so forth. How do we build trust? Do these shows help to build trust in the community?
Well, you got to go back in time. While law enforcement has become super modern with the information superhighway, we got to take it back to the neighborhoods and win one street, one neighborhood at a time. And see, people in the street, people whose families become victims of crimes by the losing of a loved one, they can tell when you're real or not. You got to be in those neighborhoods before that tape goes up, whether it is buying a newspaper or a bottle of water. You got to be out there. That's how you build the trust. If you only show up when the tape is hanging up, wrapped around, Chevys and Cadillacs in the middle of the street, I mean, they don't trust you. I mean, I just never was afraid to be out there in the streets. We have to serve our public. I mean, they come first. They're the taxpayers. And I think that we got to take a page out of the old school cop and get back to the beat, whether you're in a suit or whether you're in a uniform. It's your responsibility to win that trust back. This us against them mentality is not going to translate into successful policing. I think it can be done. I think we got a great mayor in the city now. He's making some changes, and I think he gets the number of bodies in them blue suits. I think he's going to make an impact we haven't seen in probably the last 30 years. Take it back to the street.
I'm in favor of, more opportunities for people in the community to see what actually happens. I think when you take away the mystery of everything, you're able to kind of understand the criminal justice system a lot better. In The Wizard of Oz, everyone wants to see what's behind the curtain. And I think that, once you give regular citizens who don't really understand the nuances of the criminal justice system the opportunity to see it at work with their own two eyes, not what they've been told by some reporters or not what they've read in the newspaper, days later, but it's what's actually going on, the way it happens. I think that it's very, very important. And as we see now, in 2022, there is a very concerted effort by the system to be more transparent. There is, opportunities, especially here in Atlanta, it happens all the time where, the media is granted access to the courtroom. They can ask for permission to film. 10 times out of 10 times, I've never known a judge to deny the media the opportunity to be present and to report. And so I think when people get a chance to see with their own two eyes what happens, I think it's helpful for them. I think it allows them to educate themselves about the system, and it gives them a chance to see what's good about the system and what's not so good about the system. And so, yes, in answer to your question, I think that it's very important, and I think it's very helpful in most cases for the community to have the opportunity to see.
How did these shows get started with the Atlanta connection? I understand you have some history on that.
Yes, I fortunately for me, I remember the time when the very first television show got started covering these kinds of cases. And so I started my career out with a trial partner in the Fulton County DA's office, who's grown on to some very famous recognition nationwide, and her name is Nancy Grace. And she was my very first trial partner. And so I learned a lot from Nancy, and we developed a very close friendship that exists to this very day. And I was actually in her office when she got a phone call from Stephen Braille, who was the creator of what came to be known as Court TV. And so Court TV was really one of the very first television shows that had as its premise to follow criminal court cases. And so Nancy was a part of the development of Court TV. She got it that way by being a guest commentator for CNN talking about the O.J. Simpson trial. And she was such a strong advocate for the prosecution side of the case that the viewership was going through the roof. She was a person who had a real spunky attitude. She wasn't afraid to take on other experts who would comment and criticize about the prosecution's case. She was very pro-victim, and she was from the South. And she had that traditional Southern look, that traditional Southern way of speaking. And I think that as people across the country started to notice her popularity grew. And so at the conclusion of the O.J. Simpson trial, I was actually sitting in her office when she got the phone call offering her an opportunity to join in a criminal court show that would be called Cochran and Grace. Johnny Cochran would present the pro-defense part of the perspective of a case. Nancy would give the pro-prosecution part of the perspective of the case. They would bring on some of the participants in the case, like detectives or investigators or lawyers for a particular case. And the entire show would be a bantering back and forth where they would discuss the merits of a really high-profile criminal case that took place somewhere in the country. And that lasted for about a year, maybe 2 years, if my memory serves me right. And then Johnny Cochran went on to some very high-profile clients like Michael Jackson and Sean Puff Daddy Combs and some other really high-profile criminal defendants that he represented, really until his untimely passing. Nancy then spun off into the development of her own show, which then led to Court TV, and then which spawned a lot of other kinds of shows just like that. And so I remember when all of that started, and there were some shows, Tracy, that were kind of in existence, but they were not quite like the coverage of an actual case where you actually went through the facts and you talked about the pros, you talked about the cons, you waited in anticipation for the verdict, because of course we had John Walsh who had his show, which was, proved to be very instrumental because it actually helped solve a case that I ended up having here in the Fulton County DA's office and actually prosecuted and was able to obtain a conviction. And that was the James Sullivan case. He was accused of having murdered a young lady here in Atlanta who was his wife. And he did it in a very, very malicious manner by hiring someone to deliver flowers to her house and then shooting her in her doorway. And he did it just so he could keep his money. They were going through a very contentious divorce. And so he was a fugitive for about 10 years. But the way in which he was captured was an American couple who was vacationing in Thailand saw him walking on the beach and remembered they had seen the story on John Walsh's show. And they called the FBI, and the FBI was able to come to Thailand and work with the Thai officials and actually take him into custody. It's a fantastic story. It's a 1 in a million kind of situation. But it was because that show was in existence. Victim's family was able to get a sense of closure, although it took 19 years from the date of the young lady's death to bring him to justice. But sometimes the wheels of justice turn very slowly.
Atlanta is a city that forgets easily. And to be honest, Lita was remembered by her friends, by her family. But if you'd ask someone in Buckhead today, do you know Lita Sullivan or what happened to her in this townhouse? A lot of people would go, who and what and when or where? The case of Lita Sullivan has only remained relevant to her parents and the people who knew her and loved her.
The prosecution of these cases sometimes is like putting together a puzzle. And so the thing that I have been able to develop over 25 years is putting these puzzle pieces together in such a way that is very, very compelling to jurors. And it also tells a very complete story. My strategy tends to be as transparent as I can about the facts and the circumstances of each and every case. I think that in order to be very successful with people who sit as jurors, and they're 12 individual citizens, they don't know me, I don't know them, but I've got to be the most credible person in the room so that I can gain their confidence and trust that what it is I'm telling them is actually the truth. And so I do keep some things close to the vest in terms of my strategies sometimes, but I find overwhelmingly that transparency and honesty and allowing the jurors to really get a glimpse inside is very, very impactful.
Well, one of the other things that was exciting to me is some of the cases, I'm an Atlanta native, and some of the cases that I grew up hearing about have gone to the big screen. And Angeline, one of your stories definitely went to the big screen. We had the Richard Jewell film, and parts of that were filmed in the Fulton County Courthouse. How does that change the game, being able to be on the big screen when these cases are publicized in that way?
For me, I mean, really, it's no different. It's just a lot of more people who are paying attention to the case, whether it's they're doing a case from 20 something years ago or a case now. But, you know, that Richard Jewell case and how, you know, living that day to day in 1996, right? That sounds like a long time ago, but anybody who was a reporter in Atlanta during that time lived that case because there are so many different elements to that. But you know, years later, seeing it on the screen, I appreciate what they did because I think there were a lot of things that they got right. And I saw the acting in it was so well. I didn't have high expectations, and I usually don't have high expectations. Whenever something that I particularly worked on makes it to the big screen, I just kind of lower because there's no way. It's kind of like when you read a book, right? And then you think, oh, they're turning this book, this great book that I just read, into some film, and it's not the same. But that one, I think it was well done. I like when there is that kind of attention and it moves to the screen because for me, I do whatever I can to make sure they get it right. Because you'll have production companies that'll come in here and they'll just do what they think their version is. But if I am asked, I just feel like it's a personal obligation. If I'm connected to any story, I want to make sure I can do whatever I can to help them get it right. And a lot of companies need that guidance, it turns out.
What do you hear from people who listen to your podcast, who've watched you on America's Most Wanted and so forth? What are they getting out of this?
You know, I think the number one thing is that I'm telling a story that they may have heard about, but it's giving them a totally different perspective, whether it's I'm talking to the investigator who's never spoken before about a case, or spending more time with a survivor and having her talk about actually what happened, you know, because there's things that end up, as we talked about earlier, that when a case is first brought on the news, there's stuff that ends up in the cutting room floor. And that's what made me want to do this podcast in the first place. It's called Inside Crime because we go the next layer. We go inside the crime and give you a whole different perspective, introduce you to the real people behind the scenes. Again, whether it's the survivors or the investigators who've never talked before, and that is the reaction. The feedback has been like, I never knew that. I always wanted to know more. And now here it is. And it's really the human factor. I think I'm not under some kind of restraint as far as time is concerned. I don't have to follow any news director's rules. I just do the podcast the way I want to tell the story and connect with that person and introduce that person to the listener. It's just that simple.
This is the new thing. I mean, podcasting is huge. I listen to Angeline's, and hers is amazing. The stories she brings, have you on there crying. She had me crying on this last one that she did about that little boy that had been missing, or his murder had been unsolved all those years. Angeline carried that thing.
23
she carried
years.
it like it was another heart of hers. And what was that child's name, just so I'm clear?
William Deshaun Hamilton.
That
He was 6 years old, and he was found in a cemetery there in DeKalb County, next to a cemetery. He was unidentified. We couldn't figure out who he was. I happened to be there the day he was found when DeKalb County police got the call. So I've been covering that story since day one. And it became
an amazing job on that. Amazing job. And that's just it. Everybody's a detective. Angeline did detective work on that. What did she say before? Listening. Cops don't listen. I'm just being critical of my peeps. They don't listen. They're looking for outcome. You got to let the process unfold and use those ears, like my girl Angeline said.
Thank you again for joining us for the Fulton Films Red Carpet Film and TV series, A Hybrid Experience. Our conversation delved into the crime series Fascination and Film Facts. We'll have more details about our guests in the notes. Please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel.